there, Dr. Scott Masson, introducing season 2 of Paideia today with my colleague Bill Friesen. And today we're going to introduce our second season with a look throughout the whole season on the Middle Ages, so-called. And we'll want to define what those are. I'll leave that to Bill, since he is the most in the room. Obviously, even when he does that, I know there's some dispute amongst the medievalists of what constitutes the Middle Ages, but we'll leave it with that. I wanted to say a few brief words about the general contours of the podcast. We talked in the very first episode about our hopes and ambitions for it, and chiefly in just discussing the great works of literature as cultural icons, as works of imagination, things that could not be reduced to mere sociological forces as if we were studying cultural anthropology, but genuinely seeing them as works of art that also speak to us today in ways that are profound and rich, and in many ways broaden our own viewpoint, but they illustrate the good, the true, and the beautiful. Whether we recognize that in our day or not is another issue, but we believe that there's goodness in this, and that this conversation that we're having is too little had in the Academy today. So we're offering it to our listeners and viewers for their edification, hopefully their enjoyment. But without further ado here, Bill, what are we looking at today exactly?
We're going to be looking, well, we're going to have a general conversation a little bit about the Middle Ages themselves and what constitutes the Middle Ages. And then with what time remains, we're going to get into one of the most important and yet most overlooked genres, I would say not just of the Middle Ages, but in Western literature overall, which is hagiography, which are holy writings is what hagiography means. Hagio, holy, and graphos, writing. But of course, you know
Right.
that with your ancient Greek.
One of the things that we talked about is something that's sort of odd about this topic is when you discuss the lives of the saints, one tends not to see these as works of literature per se, but rather as biographies. That's one of the things that you are going to illuminate the listener about, the fact that these are not biographies per se. There's something more to them, and also maybe less to them than biographies, because they're not particularly historically accurate as we would expect a biography to be.
No, it's this is one of the first errors that usually is made by people when they're reading saints' lives or studying saints' lives as literature. They assume that they are histories of some kind, or maybe they're biographies, as you say, when this was never the intention of a good saint's lives.
It's part of the confusion here, Bill, for both we're both Protestants here, but it's part of the confusion, the assumption that a saint's life will be reflecting on the deeds that the saints had committed in order to be called a saint, because in the process of announcing or proclaiming that somebody is a saint, there's a certain process by which they have to have done a certain number of miracles. They need to be testified and scrutinized, and these are obviously historical acts, but the hagiography is not doing that necessarily per se. So there's a conflation of two things there and a confusion. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Or
That's a fair characterization. Saints' lives are doing quite a number of things that you and I have already discussed in previous podcasts. So a saint's life is, like the other works, it's got those double objectives we spoke about, docere et movere, to teach the heart and mind, if you will, and also to move the passions. That's what it's trying to do. So it's still trying to do what literature has always done, but with perhaps a somewhat different orientation in its impulse, because also it's engaging, again, a saint's life is engaging in mimesis, just as we discussed previously. And it's trying to cultivate mimesis, that is to say, the process of inspiring through both mind and the passions, imitation, if you will, of certain characteristics. And we were looking at heroes and heroism previously, and the different species of heroism that we encounter in classical works. Here again, we're looking at the dynamics of imitation. We're looking again at the dynamics of heroism, but now we're looking at it from a very, very different perspective than previously, because we're looking at it from a Christian perspective.
Right.
And so how does a thinking Christian reconcile heroism to the impulses of great literature? Whose heroism are we celebrating?
Mm.
And of course, the answer, if you think about it for a moment, isn't that difficult. The heroism specifically that we're trying to inspire or to inspire imitation of is the heroism of Christ, not human.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, many of the dynamics, though familiar, have to get reworked in order to function again as literature. One of the things a good saint's life is doing is it's actually rendering the saint himself or herself, if you like, as transparent as possible. So if you are moved and
Sorry, what
informed,
do you mean by transparent here?
that is to say that if you admire something in the saint, you admire it secondarily. So the saint embodies certain qualities and features, and you see those qualities and you admire those qualities, either consciously or subconsciously. You are impelled to imitate those qualities, but the qualities don't come from the saint himself or herself. They come, if you like, through the saint. The saint is inspired by Christ's example and tries to live a life of imitation, imitating what Christ did and what Christ thought and what Christ felt and all these sorts of things, in order to cultivate his or her Christian character. And insofar as they're successful at doing so, they are simply reflecting Christ's character and nature. They are not embodying it. So one of the things that a good saint's life writer, a good hagiographer, is trying to do is trying to write a relatively generic portrait of the
So
saint.
why don't you give us an example of that? Have you got a text at hand to illustrate?
Yeah, if you're studying hagiography, there's really three beginning texts you want to get under your belt and think carefully about. One of them is the life of St. Paul the Hermit, not to be confused with St. Paul. This is a different Paul.
Of the
And
Bible,
yes, that's
not Paul of Tarsus. Yeah.
no. So St. Paul the Hermit is how he's typically known. This is one of the most inspirational early saints' lives and sets kind of a model for how things are going to be done. But even more important are the lives of Saint Martin on the one hand, and the life of Saint Anthony on the other hand. So Anthony and Martin are probably, I would say, the two beginning texts, and then if you can fit in Saint Paul the Hermit, this is a good idea as well. And the life of Saint Anthony, written by the very famous writer, the Bishop Athanasius, but we don't have time to talk about him. But this is how the life of Saint Anthony begins. Anthony, you must know, was by descent an Egyptian. His parents were of good family and possessed considerable wealth. And as they were Christians, he also was reared in the same faith. In infancy, he was brought up with his parents, knowing nothing else but them and his home. But when he was grown and arrived at boyhood and was advancing in years, he could not endure to learn letters, not caring to associate with other boys. But all his desire was, as it is written of Jacob, to live as a plain man at home. With his parents he used to attend the Lord's house, and neither as a child was he idle, nor when older did he despise them, but was both obedient to his father and mother and attentive to what was read, keeping in his heart what was profitable in what he heard. And though as a child brought up in moderate affluence, he did not trouble his parents for varied or luxurious fare, nor was this a source of pleasure to him, but was content simply with what he found, nor sought anything further. And so that's your first little bit of the life of St. Anthony. What stands out here immediately and what you encounter in one saint's life after another, provided they're well written, is that the author makes immediately plain at the outset that there is nothing extraordinary or special about the man or the woman themselves.
So these are not Wunderkind. They're not the Mozarts, the little geniuses from birth.
Yeah, Anthony is a bit of a lump, to be honest. He's not ambitious. He's not bright. He's not charismatic. There's nothing promising about this person, and he becomes one of the most famous saints of all time. And this is Athanasius doing good work. He's making sure you understand at the outset there's nothing wonderful or magnificent or particularly heroic, to use the pagan language, about Anthony. This is not an Achilles. This is not an Odysseus. This is not an Aeneas. This is a very unpromising young man.
And so when he's doing that, he's really following a biblical understanding of what the transformation of the gospel and the gift of the Holy Spirit does. It makes new people, and the old person, it's not their character attributes, their intellectual brilliance, their physical strength. It's none of those things that constitutes a good Christian. It's following Christ that makes them who they genuinely are.
Their deeds are very generic. So if their deeds don't openly and explicitly imitate deeds from Christ's life in the Gospels, then they will very closely imitate the deeds of other legitimate saints already in the Christian literary tradition, that is to say, in hagiography. But most of the deeds that you see saints doing are variations of well-known deeds from Christ's life in Scripture. And that is not a mistake. It's not that they lack imagination, these writers. They don't. Their artistry oftentimes is in the variation of the deed from gospel in the life of the saint. And so you've got to be continually of two minds. This is something that is very, very distinctive of the late antique period and right into the Middle Ages. They are continuously comparing two or more things, but two things in particular. So much so that they developed an entire genre, which is now largely no longer studied, called the opus geminatum, the twinned work. And they will have two works meant to be read, one directly after the other. And you are in your mind to be continuously comparing the two things. One might be in verse and the other one in prose. One might be a rather more lyrical treatment of a subject, and the next one is more prosaic.
Reminds me a little bit of Plutarch's lives and the parallel lives of a Greek and a Roman. Any influence there, or is this?
Yeah, considerable. I mean, early Christian writers, and right into the Middle Ages, don't dispense with the pagan literary inheritance. We've talked about this with Augustine, but it's worth signaling here again. So this tendency to compare and adopt a comparative mindset when you're either writing or reading a text, they borrow directly from a number of pagan influences. And this was strategic. This was not incidental or accidental. This was something they very much meant to do. And as you mentioned Plutarch, but there's a number of other examples we can draw on the same sort of thing in pagan literature. It was also a very common practice in the late antique period for students to have to take a venerated work of literature, rewrite it in some different form, and then write it back into the same form again, but based off of their variation of the work. So it's, in some senses, it's a little bit like some approaches to classical music, where you've got theme and variation, theme and variation, theme and variation, where the phrase is being varied, and that's where the artistry happens.
That's where you can recognize that it's happened, because you can see the pattern and the deviation from the pattern.
Correct. And again, we discussed binary modes of thinking and whatnot in previous episodes, but it's worth thinking about here again, binary opposition. This is this compared to that, and not compared to anything else. So yeah, they're borrowing on this. The borrowing tactics are in fact pervasive. I mentioned earlier the mimetic impulse. I want to come back to that a little bit now. Christian writers were deeply concerned with heroism and models of heroism and how to adapt that to new Christian purposes. Augustine talks about this, Jerome talks about this, Sedulius talks about this, Sulpicius talks about this. Everyone's talking about this. And so what you end up with, as I mentioned before, is this mode whereby you're trying to inspire imitation of heroism, but it's through this concept imitatio Christi. Everything is in imitation of Christ. And this is absolutely core. If you don't get that about the figures in hagiography, you're not going to get anything.
Right.
So in some senses, if you are reading a saint's life, you pretty well have to have your gospels open beside you at your elbow, because you can refer back to them continuously and have a look, okay, how did the author take and adapt this particular deed, and what's inspiring about it? Or not inspiring, as the case may be. To this end, a lot of people comment disparagingly on saints' lives, saying, "Look, they're kind of generic. They're not terribly imaginative." And this one's a fair bit like that other one, which is sounding again like that other one there.
Which then directly contradicts our view of what a literary work will be, which is an imaginative work, and have some novelty to it, and they have none.
Yeah, novelty and even originality are not good, but bad words to a lot of traditional writers in the Western tradition, not just Christian writers, even pagan writers as well. They wanted to be borrowing from and taking up the authority of tradition. And so in some senses, the more generic you could make a saint's life, the more legitimate it would seem to its readers.
Yeah.
So you have to remember that. You can see this also with Orthodox iconography,
I
Where
was
they're
just going to say that, Bill. That's exactly where I was going to go.
good.
And how unrealistic the portraits are. In fact, how bad they are. If you
Yeah,
think it looks like a child has drawn, or me, or I have drawn the portrait because it's so unrealistic. You know, surely you could do better than that.
yeah.
And furthermore, the icons often seem very similar to one another in their lack of realism, if you will. And it always strikes, it used to strike me, I understand now, but why were they so incapable of realistic portraiture? The obvious answer is they were capable, they sought not to do that. And then the question is why?
Yeah, it's oftentimes saints' lives, as I said, are mocked for their genericism. And likewise, iconography is oftentimes mocked for its not genericism, but its unrealistic, unoriginal quality.
Mm,
And the person thinks, who is critiquing thus, oftentimes thinks that, he's the one who is cultured and erudite and sophisticated, and the artist or the hagiographer is the one who's actually doing the crude, uncultured thing. When in point of fact, it's exactly the opposite way around, and the critic is making that plain through his criticism. They
right.
really don't know what iconography is supposed to be doing. They're approaching it with completely unlearned, uninformed lens, and using that to mock something they don't fully understand.
Right. And so that this is the critique of Western art, is that suddenly, the Middle Ages, being the Dark Ages, so-called, were incapable of realism. And then come the Renaissance, there's a discovery of realism and an embrace of life as it truly is, as opposed to the blurry lens of faith of the previous period. And now we really understand the way things are, and thereby we paint it more realistically, et cetera, et cetera. But and then imaginative literature flourishes out of that. You're asserting that it is the exact opposite, that we're applying what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery to the texts of the past and not reading them on their own terms. And actually what we hold to be valuable, so do they to some degree. It's just that they see in Christ the hero, and a hero that cannot be surpassed. And in fact, to attempt to surpass him is to diminish him and to fail to understand him. And the saints and the writers of these hagiographies are intentionally diminishing the heroism of the saint as a man or a woman, right? That's what you're saying.
Yeah, you mentioned Lewis, and that's, I think, quite apt here. Lewis noted that in order to appreciate the artistry of a lot of what goes on in the Middle Ages, whether that's in hagiography or other works or iconography or even architecture, you actually needed a lot of very sophisticated training. There's a lot going on the page, and the modern reader, or even the Renaissance reader, was blind to an enormous amount of it. The first time I encountered this difficulty was way back during my master's studies. And somebody was mocking, a professor, in fact, a medievalist who should have known better, was mocking the crudeness and lack of historicity of a saint's life.
Hmm.
And luckily in that class was an older student, a mature student, we would have called him, who was actually an Augustinian monk. I was troubled by the sneering disparagement of this work, because I was beginning to see glimmers of real artistry and depth in this. And also the professor in question who was doing the mocking was hostile to the Christian impulses of the text. And so that just added.
Right. So it was just a pretext. Yeah.
Yeah. And this Augustinian monk pulled me aside and said, he's really not getting it, what the text is trying to do, how it's trying to do it, the traditions on which it's drawing. He's not seeing any of this stuff. And whether that's willfully closing his eyes to it or simply that he has never been educated in these matters, remains a mystery to this day. But that was the beginning of me really diving into saints' lives and really trying to understand the artistry, the literary art of what was going on there.
So, and one of those things is, and let me deal with a common misconception here. One of the things that is thought by Protestants at any rate, and certainly by atheists, is that in saints' lives we are worshiping a saint, or being called upon to pray to a saint. I mean, that happens as well. And in the case of a Protestant, what we're doing is replacing God with a saint, and thereby committing a species of idolatry. And for the atheist, this is just simply, this crude and quite frankly unrealistic embrace of a life that does not apply to our life. Can you speak to that at all, about the issue of worshiping the saints, speaking to the saints, praying to the saints? What's going on there with all of that?
Yeah, there's a simple distinction that is made. The first thing I should say is that, to backtrack a little bit, while saints' lives are deliberately generic and don't claim to be historically authoritative, nevertheless, we have to remember that the echoes of actual history, and for that matter, biography, do still haunt saints' lives to a greater or lesser degree. And a lot of good hagiographies actually play with that tension. So that's the first thing we should say.
So what do you mean by that?
That is to say, there, if we're reading, for instance, the very famous life of Saint Cuthbert, an Irish saint who's one of the great founders of Christianity.
His bones are buried in Durham Cathedral and so forth. Yes.
Yeah, there is a real Cuthbert. There was a real mission that he founded. There were real conversions that were made. There were real historical figures he met and influenced. Many of the deeds in that saint's life actually happened historically, and we have archaeological record of them. And as you say, you have the very bones of the saint ready to hand, if you like. So there's a lot of history echoing in that. And the Venerable Bede, who wrote that particular life, was an incredibly erudite writer and thinker.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew about this historical aspect of it. In fact, Bede is one of the most famous historians ever.
Yep.
And he plays with that tension. He loves that tension. And so he keeps tweaking that. He does it in some really surprising and insightful ways. And we don't have the opportunity to get into it here, but it's there. But the other thing we should say here is that, as we said before, you could admire the saint and his or her qualities as a Christian. This person's really living a good, powerful, moving, meaningful Christian life. And that admiration, or veneration, to use more traditional language, is known as dulia. That's the Latin word for it. Whereas...
how do you spell that?
D-U-L-I-A. Very simple.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, worship, this is the key distinction between veneration and worship, is latria, L-A-T-R-I-A. Latria is appropriate to God alone, to the Trinity.
That's reserved for God alone.
Yes. Now, if all of a sudden latria begins to attach to the saint somehow on the part of the reader of the saint's life, or the person worshiping in front of an icon, then you've got full-on heresy. And, that's Catholicism 101, or it should be Catholicism 101. So this is a distinction made by pretty well any learned Catholic or Orthodox individual out there. Veneration for the saint, worship for God alone. And that's foundational. And so, again, when the atheist mocks, or for that matter, when the Protestant mocks this superstitious praying to the saint, they're just illustrating their own ignorance.
And perhaps there's a misunderstanding among some Catholics about what they're actually doing there as well. And so maybe they're not so misinformed.
That's happened a lot historically. And
Yeah.
the Catholic Church continuously has to struggle against this. But it's essentially it's a 1,500-year-old battle, and it's not going away anytime soon.
No. So what's with the idea of a patron saint and so forth? So, some people historically, people are named after figures in the Bible, but they're also named after saints. And so you have a patron saint, and the patron saints are associated with places, but also with vocations and so forth. What's with that there?
The saint oftentimes becomes associated with a community or an individual, for that matter, in two ways that I can name just off the top of my head. A is geographic location. This is very, very important. When somebody is canonized as a saint, or to use more accurate language, when they're accepted as a saint, up until the early 13th century, there was no official process for this. It was an entirely organic process. And if enough people admired an individual for his or her Christian faith in an area, that person rapidly became a saint.
Their local saint.
Yeah, Rome had no control over this whatsoever. They tried to impose control on this after approximately 1231. But even then, their control over who was canonized ultimately as a saint and who was not remained problematic at best. So there is this notion that there's a formula, and if the saint fulfills the formula, then he or she qualifies to be canonized as a saint. It's a lot more complicated.
Although later on that would be the case, right? But you're talking
Yeah,
about its early beginnings and the
correct.
hagiography, etc.
When the traditions were essentially laid down. The assumption is that as one is enjoined to request prayer from the living on certain fronts, prayer to God. And so you would ask somebody, could you pray about this? Could you pray about that? I have these concerns. I have these needs, whatever it might be. So also, could the dead hear our prayers? So this is a controversial point, obviously.
Well, they're dead in the
Um,
sense that they're not in this world, but they're in the sense that they believe in Christ. There is no death. So this is the church triumphant, right?
yes. And so as you enjoin the living to pray for you, so also you enjoin the dead, particularly the dead you admire as Christians, to pray for you. So you would ask, oh, I don't know, St. Lawrence is a good one. St. Lawrence is the patron saint of cooks. He was actually cooked to death on his own cooking equipment.
Hmm.
And, maybe you're a cook, and so you feel that that somehow associates your identity more with St. Lawrence. And if you actually come from the same vicinity as St. Lawrence, that's another connection. So you might enjoin or ask St. Lawrence to actually pray for you on matters X, Y, and Z. So you're not actually praying to St. Lawrence, you're asking him to pray along with you for this concern that you have.
And it's a concern that concerns that particular saint because he has the same vocation, etc.
Sure, yeah. So there's this notion that when one prays, or when one asks for prayer of a saint, that one is praying to the saint, him or herself. And this is, of course, a false notion. And we were talking about matters of association and what have you here as well, a patron saint of this or the patron saint of that. And again, this is just a matter of identity. If I have a certain vocation and that saint had the same vocation, then of course I'm going to somehow feel more closely connected with that saint. The saint is somehow more,
He's part of your guild.
yeah, if you will. But you're not just praying to saints on this basis here. Remember, it's what inspires your request for prayer from the saint is the saint's Christian heroism. So you have to think quite carefully and complexly about what that entails.
So this is the use of saints in general in the Christian life, at least throughout the Middle Ages, up until the Reformation, would be used by Christians very broadly. Let's talk about the literary form, though. When you talked about the generic portrait, and that I assume that extends not only from the description, so the setting, but also to the characterization of the individuals as well. Is that also a broadly true statement? What you're describing here is a sort of an everyman type figure, except everyman with some specific, when I say everyman, I'm talking about the medieval morality play and this sort of allegorical figure, which Dante to some degree will also be when he comes to write his Divine Comedy. He is Dante the poet, but he is to some degree going on the pilgrimage that everyone will undergo to some degree. But whereas the saint seems to have some specificity to him or her. So there are some distinctions there. And how is that reflected in the literary form?
Well, the saint who's the focus, as I said, he has to have heroic qualities, or she has to have heroic qualities which imitate Christ's heroic qualities. But also the notion of you admiring and petitioning this saint for their prayers is dependent on another pagan model, which is the patron-client model.
Say something about that. That's a Roman thing, right?
Yeah, this is something which absolutely dominates Roman society. You can't understand how Roman society works without understanding foundationally the patron-client relationship. So the notion is that the client, the needy individual, the younger individual, the less capable individual, the more humble individual, seeks out and attempts to secure the patronage of somebody he or she admires, usually in a field or a vocation that is associated with them. And this patron kind of takes the client under his wing. It is almost invariably his.
Bit more than a mentor?
Yes, a fair bit more than a mentor. So the patron can do things like educate the individual and guide the education of an individual. The patron can introduce you, network, to use a modern term, on behalf of a client, introduce you to the right people in the right places, on the right projects. They can safeguard you from various depredations. And so much of what is happening, even in up into modern Western society, actually has in it the ghost of the patron-client relationship. So, if you go to a university and you're doing a PhD, they very quickly line you up with your thesis advisor.
Well, in German, they even call him your Doktorvater. So
Yeah.
it's literally, it's retained the father in the name. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's your thesis advisor. He guides your education. He corrects things that you've done wrongly. He introduces you to the people you need to know. He opens up opportunities for publications and whatnot, which you might not otherwise have had. He's doing so many of the things based on the tradition of the patron-client relationship. This also informs what's happening with people who are petitioning the saint for prayer, or who are reading, for that matter, hagiography as a source of inspiration. The saint becomes the patron. This is why we call them the patron saint. I mean, that's literally, the language is still in place.
Right.
And this patron does for you now, in a Christian context and in Christian ways, what the Roman patron would have done for his or her client. And so that's why you sort of glom onto them. And that's why, because you've only got one patron, you can't have multiple patrons. There's one to whom you're.
Now, this is not a consumer relationship.
No, it is not. In fact, the patron will almost invariably give more than he gets out of this relationship. So the client is in very much a petitionary mood. Would you please, would you please, would you please? And if the patron deigns, then yes, I will support you with this or that. We've already talked about one of these patrons glancingly when we spoke about Virgil and the Aeneid. Probably the most famous patron of them all is Maecenas, so much so that later on in years, when you wanted to say somebody was a good patron, or somebody a good magister, you would say, oh, he's a veritable Maecenas, and everybody would know what you meant. So also with the saints.
So he's the patron saint of patrons.
Yeah, he's your patron if if he accepts your pleas to pray on your behalf, to intercede, to use more traditional language, on your behalf, between you and God. There's somebody in between who's actually managing that to some extent.
Wiser and more capable.
Correct. He's a Christian hero. You are not. Who are you? You're a nobody. But you're asking the hero to be your patron for godly purposes. And that's what
it just strikes me when you're saying this, how and it's not just how different, it's how categorically opposite the view of heroism is now, in the sense that I talked about this before, and I'll reiterate it throughout the series, the idea of the orphan as the hero of the fiction, who has to rely on himself or herself, and whatever strength or wisdom lies within him, and nobody can guide that person. They are their own guides. They have no father, literally, but they also have no father figure. There's no patron. You are your own patron. You're pulling yourselves literally up by your own bootstraps, so to speak. So it's just so different. Lewis writes a work called The Discarded Image. It's not just the image that's been lost. It's this idea of being mentored and patronized in the best sense that's been lost.
Yeah, the individuality actually becomes a necessary heroic quality as we move into the modern era. And whether you want to start that in the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, or with the Romantics especially, of course, it's up in the air. But the notion that you would function without a powerful patron up until about 1475, 1500 was completely alien, maybe even a little bit grotesque to most readers. And I think we need to keep that in mind.
So these are not holy biographies.
No, these are not at all. We talked about, when we were discussing Augustine, we were talking about value, intrinsic value and instrumental value, and these sorts of things, and pleasure and use, and models like that. Again, back into the beloved dichotomies of ancients and medievals. And it was Augustine's view, controversial albeit, that human beings were purely for use, full stop. The only proper object of pleasure was God. So also, especially with saints' lives. Augustine understood all these saintly distinctions. The saint's value was as a means, not an end. The end is the glory of God and the love of God. And if the saint's life isn't doing that, If the saint is getting in the way, then then that particular saint's life is failing. This is the central notion. So even as you admire the patron, it's the admiration which is necessarily dulia. It's secondary or contingent admiration, because through that saint you can see the nature of God and glorify him.
So that sounds like, I mean, there's the generic quality you've made very clear here. And I think the idea of thinking of an icon and how its portraiture is not realistic, and yet you see through the icon rather than you looking at the icon, you're supposed to look through it. And it's something about the way in which the figure, whether it's Christ or the Trinity or whatever, is representing something that makes you look at it rather differently. So that the generic aspect has been clear. Are there different types of hagiographies, though?
The earliest saint's life, oftentimes we say, if we're studying this in a formal sense, is biblical. Stephen the proto-martyr, if you will.
Right.
Stoned. He's stoned to death, yes. Now that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it does exert a fair amount of influence on the hagiographical tradition at the outset. So it's important to note. So you've got to read that and really sort of take apart exactly what the biblical account gives you of this.
What's really interesting about that account is when Stephen looks up, he sees Jesus standing. And Jesus is in the New Testament, after he's risen and ascended, is portrayed as being seated at the Father's right hand, and seating as being in a position of power and authority. He's ruling. But here he's standing up as if perhaps to honor the one who's given his life to him. It's almost like giving applause, right? It's extraordinary.
Yeah, and this is a phrase you begin to encounter a lot in the Middle Ages, especially in holy writings, because hagiography is only one species of a bunch of different genres of holy writing that you encounter in the Middle Ages, which is that as now heroism is completely reworked, in many ways stood on its head and directly contrasting ancient heroism, so also the admiration for a good saint's life as literature. They'll say right at the beginning, this was not written for the applause of men. This is written for the applause of heaven. And if it doesn't get that and gets distracted by the praise of men, then the hagiographer has failed in his purpose. So
they're not after the Nobel Prize.
No, in fact, as a good hagiographer, you would have to aggressively reject that. In fact, in another place, I think it's Bede who says this. He says, even if this saint's life is never read, even if it is lost immediately after I have written it and nobody ever hears about it, that's fine. It doesn't matter. Heaven knows that it was written and written well, and heaven's literary appreciation, as well as other forms of appreciation, are vastly more important. And so I don't really care what happens to my saint's life. In fact, most saints' lives, the authors try to go out of their way not to have their name attached to it. So we've got, I would say, approximately over three quarters of the saints' lives that survive are anonymous.
Anonymous, and just like Beowulf, eh?
Yes, and that is a deliberate tactic. And this maybe brings up another point I should talk about briefly. I said before, saints' lives were an enormously important genre of literature, to not just the Middle Ages, but to the Western tradition. And they have a profound influence on secular literatures, pagan literatures that come thereafter, for instance, Beowulf and works like this, or various Arthurian works. And if you haven't studied your saints' lives and don't understand the mechanics of how they work, you don't see a lot of the artistry that's happening in other ostensibly more secular texts that you encounter in the Middle Ages, and even into the Renaissance for that matter. And this brings me to yet another distinction. You were asking about generic distinctions. The first saints' lives that were written about people who were martyred. That is to say, about people who were so heroic that they were willing to die for the faith. And of course, we have many thousands and thousands of people to whom this actually happened during the great persecutions under the early the rise of the Christian church under the Romans. And so the first saint's life that we have dates from about 165 AD, and it's the life of Saint Polycarp. And Saint Polycarp refuses to recant his faith and is famously killed. I believe it's in the Roman Colosseum. And he's killed by being bound into a red-hot iron chair. That's how they actually eliminate him. Bad way to go. There may have been other saints' lives written before this, but they're now lost to us. And certainly many of the ones that were written afterwards are lost to us. But this grows up. One of the first distinctions we have to make with saints' lives. You have the lives of the martyrs, if you will. And these dominate the early years of hagiography. But as time passes, and as we encounter with the life of St. Anthony, for instance, we then run into people who were not killed for their faith, but lived particularly holy lives, maybe quite long lives, as did St. Anthony. So these are the lives of what they call the confessors.
By confess, we mean here.
Yeah, they speak in a different form as witnesses to the faith and the power of the Holy Spirit in the lives of certain individuals and the way that this glorifies God. So St. Anthony famously almost tries to get himself martyred at a certain point. It's actually, the answer comes back that no, you're not going to be martyred. You're going to have to stay here in the realm of death. And that's how many saints' lives would talk about the world. This is the grave. This is the realm of entropy. This is the realm of death. This is the realm of sadness and disappointment.
Of sin and, yeah.
You don't get out of that quickly, because remember, the saint is anticipating life in heaven in communion with God. This is the whole objective, if you will, to some extent. But you don't get to go there. You have to stay here and suffer for the faith.
Right.
There's a different kind of a heroism that quickly grows up from this kind of saint's life. And so and then they would begin to many scriptoria would begin to bind together collections of saints' lives. And this is one of the first ways they made distinctions about this. You had the libellus for the lives of confessors, and you had the passionals for the lives of martyrs, and then only later did they begin to combine those sorts of things.
And then there are others that are added to that later on.
Yeah, the writing of saints' lives, as I said, goes on and on and on. It's one of the things a lot of people don't know is that, for every secular text that survives to us from the Middle Ages, Dark Ages, there are many, 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 many saints' lives. And they were read for, they weren't just read for instruction, spiritual instruction. They were, as I said, they were read for inspiration. They were read for entertainment. So later on, after the conversion of Iceland in 1200 AD, we hear offhand accounts of people opening a book of saints' lives and reading them during dinner for entertainment. They weren't just telling Viking pagan tales, they were doing that as well. But they were also reading these things for entertainment purposes. And then, of course, we have to talk about models of reading, because sometimes you have certain texts that were designed for public readings, sort of during dinner, what have you, at the monastery or something like this. And these tend to be pretty straightforward texts. There's not a lot of complexity. The languages, the diction levels are comparatively low. And then you have others that are designed specifically for in-depth, slow contemplation. Rumination is how they describe it. In fact, we use the word ruminate when we're talking about thinking about a work of literature, borrowing that term from early writers of hagiography. They had a four-part model for how you're supposed to read these contemplative saints' lives. So there's a distinction there. You've also got distinctions between prose saints' lives and verse saints' lives. So there's another distinction. You've got some which are written in Greek or Latin, and others which are written in the vernacular. So you got quite a number of Old English saints' lives, the most famous of which, of course, is Andreas. But there are plenty of other ones as well. Then you've got the Opus Geminatum, where you've got a saint's life written in Latin on one page, and on the other page, you've got it written in the vernacular, whether it's Old Norse or Old English or Old French or something like this.
Fascinating. What's the intent in doing it in a sort of a dual language? Is it education, edification of those who can't speak? Is it sort of a Protestant intent? Any thoughts?
It is and it isn't. I mean, the subject of Anglo-Saxon saints' lives is vast in scope in and of itself. And to some extent, a large part of the vernacular impulse that begins to take over saints' lives comes from the Anglo-Saxons, because the Anglo-Saxons, unlike any other people who were converted to Christianity in Europe, had their cultural traditions, including their language and literary traditions, not discarded, but very carefully and very strategically assimilated. And we'll talk more about that when we get to actual Anglo-Saxon literatures like Beowulf. And so they cultivated a admiration for Old English literature, particularly in verse and things like this. And then they sought ways to actually convert that to the use, in this case, of saints' lives and things of that nature. And because the Anglo-Saxons became in the Dark Ages, they sent out missionaries who not just converted, but also educated. You have to remember that this is a dual impulse with missionaries in the Middle Ages. They're the ones who initiated the missionary impulse back into pagan areas of Europe. So Germany was converted by Anglo-Saxons. Scandinavia's conversion was heavily influenced by Anglo-Saxons. The reforms of the Catholic Church in Merovingian and then Carolingian France is entirely managed by Anglo-Saxons. It's Anglo-Saxons who are doing everything on this front. So their impact in terms of culture and literature specifically is difficult to overstress. And
Interesting.
if the Anglo-Saxons do a literary thing in a certain way, i.e. write saints' lives in Old English or the vernacular, then all of a sudden the Germans are doing it. And then the French.
So whereas the Celts are often responsible for the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, but then the Anglo-Saxons of others, is what you're saying.
Yes. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon England, we'll talk about this again in later podcasts, is kind of an inverted dual hook. You've got the Irish who are converting from the north and moving south, converting the barbarian Anglo-Saxons.
From Holy Island and all sorts of, Lindisfarne, etc.
Exactly. But you've got a second conversion impulse initiated by Rome itself through Augustine, not the Augustine we spoke about, but Augustine of
Canterbury.
That's right. We think in 597 is where it started, probably in Kent. And there you get a hook that sweeps from southern England up north. And then the two conversion invasions, if you like, meet in the middle. And they inevitably they blend and also fall into conflict and these sorts of things. So then you have a gap of about 150, 200 years as education as well as Christianity grows up in Anglo-Saxon England. And then all of a sudden, they look across the sea and they see their quote-unquote brothers. In this case, they're talking about the Germanic barbarian tribes who struggle under the burden of paganism. And they begin to think to themselves, we need to do something about this. We have an obligation to take Christianity, orthodoxy, and all these things and learning to these people. We have no other indication that the English, that is to say the Anglo-Saxons, were responsible largely for the conversion of Iceland, other than the fact that a lot of the educational, intellectual, and literary tactics of the ostensibly pagan writers in Iceland, they're using Anglo-Saxon methods. They're using Anglo-Saxon.
Very interesting.
They're using Anglo-Saxon letters.
Fascinating, Bill. So this is just, I think it's terrific. I mean, I've learned a great deal today, and I'm sure our watchers, listeners, likewise. We're going to pick it up, probably conclude it for this, because I think this is quite a lengthy podcast of necessity, I think. And next time we'll pick it up. What are we going to look at next time? Any thoughts?
Well, we could set up a little bit more of the context. We haven't spoken about the Middle Ages more generically.
Yes, I was going to say you were going to talk about that first, and then we got into this. And so we'll backtrack and talk a little bit about the Middle Ages next time, and then we'll get into some of the literary texts that arise out of it then.
Exactly. We can talk a little bit briefly about perhaps the life of Saint Anthony, if we have time for that. Or we might move on to something straight out of the Dark Ages itself, something more primitive, if you like.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Once again, I'm Scott Masson, and this is my colleague, Bill Friesen, and this is our first episode of Season 2 in Paideia today. Please join us next time. Thank you.
Thank you.